The Silver Pine County Equipment Auction was many things noisy, fast-paced, and charged with the energy of locals who came for the thrill of bargains and the scent of nostalgia under the vaulted steel beams of the town's exhibition hall. The early morning light spilled through grimy skylights, highlighting rows of surplus fire equipment, dusty office chairs, and used patrol gear, folding chairs lined the concrete floor, each creaking under the weight of flannel jackets and worn baseball caps. Vendors barked about radios that still had a few years left in them, and auctioneers kept the tempo high, gavel cracking down on one lot after another with military precision. Item 34, working spotlight tower. No. Reserve. Who will give me 50 to start? The auctioneer called, and hands shot up like clockwork. But the buzz died as soon as the assistant led the next item into the ring. He was limping. Shadow, a German shepherd with a dull coat and a pronounced limp, stepped cautiously into the center of the auction space. His left hind leg dragged ever so slightly, the result of an injury sustained during his final mission as a K-9 search and rescue dog. His fur was mottled with old scars and stress shedding, in the thin leather collar around his neck looked like it hadn't been replaced in years. His ears twitched at the sound of the mic feedback, and his golden eyes scanned the crowd with haunted patience. For a few seconds, no one spoke. Then came the whispers. Poor thing, probably. Got PTSD. Look at that leg. He's done. Betty bites. He ain't worth the meds. People shifted in their seats, some glancing away, others shaking their heads. The air thickened with discomfort. The auctioneer, usually so brisk, cleared his throat awkwardly. Lot 47, retired. Police dog, German shepherd, 8 years. Old, injured on duty, comes with full training documentation. He paused, eye skimming the silent audience. We'll start the bidding at $100. Do I hear 100? Nothing. Only the shuffling of catalogs and the scrape of a boot against the concrete. 90, silence. 80, still nothing. Officer. Megan Holloway stood off to the side, arms folded tightly across her chest, her jaw clenched every time someone whispered or smirked. She had trained Shadow from the time he was a hyper-focused pup with drive, stronger than his size. She had watched him pull children from rubble, stand alert through storms, and even hold his ground during a landslide. Now he was nothing more than an unwanted Lot 70. The auctioneer tried again, voice starting to falter. In the last row of chairs, an older man sat stiffly, hands folded over his belt. Buckle. Raymond Grant had seen enough auctions in his life to know when an item was dead in the water. He leaned forward slightly, ready to stand and take Leia home. His granddaughter sat beside him, knees pulled to her chest, small fingers gripping the hem of her jacket. Her brown hair was tied in a low ponytail, face pale and unreadable. She hadn't spoken a word since they arrived. 60, no hands. 50, that's when it happened. A small, unexpected voice, not loud but clear, cut through the murmur. $50. Heads turned. The auctioneer looked up, scanning the crowd. Who said that? Raymond blinked, then followed the stunned gazes to his right. Leia had raised her hand, not high but steady. Megan's eyebrows shot up. The room stilled. The auctioneer stammered, unsure. Is that a real bid? Raymond looked down at Leia, her face still blank, but her hand unwavering. He opened his mouth to object, but stopped himself. Something in her eyes froze his breath. I guess we have a bid of 50, the auctioneer said, trying to recompose himself. Do I hear 60? No one answered. Going once, going twice. Sold to the young lady in the back. There was no applause, just quiet curiosity. A few incredulous chuckles and more than a few pitying looks. Megan made her way across the ring, her boots echoing, as Shadow was gently led toward his new owner. He resisted slightly, ears flattened, but then he saw her. Leia. She hadn't moved. She just watched. Her chest rose and fell in a calm, rhythmic way that had taken months to achieve since the accident. The dog limped closer, his amber eyes locking onto hers. She didn't blink. He stopped a few feet away, dropped his hind quarters slowly to the ground, and bowed his head low. And then he sighed. It wasn't just exhaustion. It was surrender, relief, a moment of connection invisible to most, but undeniable to anyone watching closely. Megan stood off to the side, hands on her hips. Well, she muttered under her breath, eyes damp. Looks like he just got reassigned. Raymond remained seated, eyes moving between the dog and the girl. He didn't fully understand what had just happened, but he knew better than to dismiss it. Whatever had taken hold of Leia, whatever instinct had moved her to raise her hand when no one else would, it wasn't random. It was the start of something neither of them could yet name. Outside the Montana, wind stirred the dust in the parking lot. Inside, a scarred dog and a silent child shared a breath, a silence, and the beginning of their second chances. The first days at the Grant home passed like a slow tide, each hour marked by a kind of watchful stillness. Shadow, once hailed as a hero in the chaos of disaster zones, now paced the quiet halls of Raymond Grant's modest bungalow as though the walls themselves might close in. The house, nestled at the end of a tree-leaned cul-de-sac in the heart of Windendale, Oregon, had never known such tension since Raymond's military days, but now it braced itself around a wounded dog and a silent child who shared more in common than anyone knew how to say aloud. Shadow refused to eat the first night, even when Raymond placed boiled chicken into a ceramic bowl and slid it near the living room hearth. The dog only looked at it with those clouded eyes, turned his back, and lay down with a heavy sigh that echoed down the hall. Raymond had dealt with broken engines, busted transmissions, and battlefield logistics, but not this. Not a dog who mourned, not a granddaughter whose voice had gone missing the day sirens echoed across the mountain pass, and her world was carved in two. Leia stayed in her room, a converted sun porch with wide windows and faded yellow curtains. Her bed, tucked beside a bookshelf full of unread stories, faced a soft rug that now bore Shadow's hesitant paw prints. The dog refused to stay anywhere else, no matter where Raymond tried to lay down a blanket or coax him into the den. Shadow would limp back to Leia's room with quiet insistence, settling beside her bed with the discipline of a sentry on duty. It was Dr. Nathan Kessler who first came by, uninvited but welcome in the way only neighbors with good intentions can be. A tall man with careful movements and tired eyes, he brought a satchel full of creams, wraps, and a clipboard that looked far too clinical for the warmth in his voice. He's not just recovering physically, Nathan had said, squatting to examine Shadow's swollen joint, his fingers pressing gently. This dog's been through something no amount of medicine can quite reach. You'll need patience and presence. He needs to feel useful. Again, Raymond nodded, offering little more than a grunt, but something in that diagnosis struck him deeper than expected. He looked past the hallway to the room where Leia sat cross-legged on the rug, holding a book in her lap. She wasn't reading aloud. Not yet, but her lips moved ever so, slightly. That night after the house fell into its usual hush, Raymond walked past Leia's door and paused. Inside, she sat with her knees pulled to her chest, the spine of Charlotte's web propped open across her legs. Shadow lay beside her, head on his paws, his ears relaxed in a way Raymond hadn't yet seen, and though she didn't speak out loud, she was mouthing the words, her fingers brushing the page slowly as if pacing her own heartbeat. The next evening, she whispered barely. Raymond caught only fragments. The barn was very large. Her voice wavered like a breeze passing through broken glass, but it was there, real, alive. By the fourth night, she was talking directly to Shadow. The stories she shared were not from books, but from memory, scattered thoughts about her parents, the smell of her mother's lotion, the sound of her father's voice. On the phone, how she hated rain now, because it reminded her of the windshield shattering. She told Shadow everything as if the dog were some ancient confessor bound by fur and loyalty. He listened unmoving, never blinking too long, always breathing deep and steady. Shadow's body still ached. His gait remained uneven, and sudden noises made him flinch. But he never moved when she spoke, not even when the neighbor's lawnmower roared to life or a car backfired on the next street over. As long as her voice filled the room, Shadow stayed anchored. Raymond noticed the change in Leia the way one notices a plant turning towards sunlight. Subtle, gradual, undeniable. She ate her dinner at the table quietly but present. She touched the fur on Shadow's flank while watching old cartoons. She no longer cried in her sleep. It was Coach Janelle Rivers who suggested gently during a chance run-in at the community center that Leia might benefit from the reading program at her school. No pressure, she'd said, handing Raymond a flyer. Just stories and comfort. Some of the kids in my PTSD group don't talk either. Not until they feel safe. Sometimes a book opens the door. Raymond folded the flyer and slipped it into his jacket. That night, as he stood in the doorway with a mug of coffee gone cold, he watched his granddaughter lean her head gently against Shadow's shoulder. The dog shifted only slightly, just enough to nudge her hand closer to his ear. And then it came, so soft it seemed more dream than sound. A giggle. Raymond's chest tightened, and he stepped back, startled by the unfamiliar melody echoing from the room. In all the months since the accident, he had not heard Leia laugh, not once. Yet here it was clear and delicate, like wind chimes in spring. He leaned against the wall, one hand pressed his mouth. In that moment, the house didn't feel haunted anymore. It felt like a story starting over. Behind the door, Leia whispered something to Shadow that Raymond couldn't quite catch. The dog's tail gave a slow thump against the rug in reply, and for the first time in a very long time, Raymond allowed himself to believe that healing, real healing, might just be possible after all. The mornings in Sycamore Hollow had always been quiet, but lately the silence outside was no match for the growing hum of life inside the grand home. Sunlight filtered through the back porch windows, painting long golden strips across the worn hardwood floors. On one such morning, Leia sat cross-legged in the living room, her small hands wrapped gently around a tattered paperback, her voice barely above a whisper as she read aloud. Shadow lay just inches away, his chin resting on her slippered foot, tail twitching softly every time she turned a page. They had become inseparable, two shadows clinging to each other in the aftershock of separate storms. Shadow still limped slightly, His injured legs stiff in the cold, but his eyes had changed. They no longer searched the corners of the room for danger or winced at every unexpected sound. Now they followed Leia. Every footstep she took, every glance, every heartbeat, her presence soothed him, and in turn his steady company grounded her in ways her grandfather had only dared to hope for. It was during one of Leia's quiet afternoon reading sessions that Coach Janelle Rivers knocked gently on their door. She was a tall woman with streaks of silver in her braids and a voice that always seemed to land softly no matter the weight of her words. Raymond invited her in, recognizing her instantly from the old school board meetings back when his daughter was alive. Now she headed a new pilot program for children coping with trauma, using therapy dogs as listeners during storytelling circles. "I think Leia might like it," Janelle said, over a mug of strong coffee. "It's not formal therapy, just kids, books, dogs, who don't mind a few misspoken words." Raymond wasn't sure how Leia would respond. He'd grown protective of her routines, of the delicate rhythm she and Shadow had developed together. But later that evening, when he mentioned the idea over dinner, Leia looked up from her plate and gave the smallest of nods. That was all the answer he needed. The community center where the program was held sat on the edge of town, a squat brick building surrounded by uneven hedges and a gravel lot. Inside, a semicircle of BNAG chairs face a shelf overflowing with dog-eared storybooks for children gathered for that afternoon session, each carrying the same invisible weight, in different shapes: shyness, restlessness, fear. Among them was a boy named Casey. He was the youngest, no, more than 6, and he clung to his copy of Where the Red Fern Grows like it was armor. Leia and Shadow entered the room, like a breeze slipping through a cracked window, soft, quiet, unexpected. The other children looked up, but said nothing. They didn't have to. There was something about Leia that made silence feel like safety. Coach Janelle offered her a seat, but Leia chose the floor next to Shadow instead. Casey sat nearby, knees bouncing with nerves. When it came time for him to read, his voice wavered, faltering halfway through the first sentence. He tried again, failed. His lower lip began to tremble. Before anyone could speak, Leia leaned forward and whispered the words to Shadow. The dog's ears twitched, his body still. She then looked at Casey and nodded. "He likes it when someone reads." "It again," she said softly, eyes locked on the trembling boy. Casey blinked at her, uncertain, then looked at Shadow, who gave a single encouraging huff, and tried once more. This time the sentence came out smoother, still shaky, but, Coach Janelle didn't interrupt. She didn't need to. Something unspoken had taken root in that moment. The session went on. Another child read from Charlotte's Web, and Leia whispered along beside Shadow, her fingers resting lightly on his scruff. Raymond, watching from the doorway, found himself blinking harder than expected. As the afternoon wound down, the children took turns saying goodbye to the dogs. When it was Casey's turn, his tongue stumbled over the thank you he tried to give. Frustrated, he dropped his book and turned to hide his face. But Shadow was faster. The German shepherd stepped forward, lowered his head, and pressed his weight gently into the boy's lap. Casey froze. Then slowly his small hands rested on Shadow's neck. A sob from his throat, half laugh, half cry. Leia stood and walked over. She knelt beside him, placed her hand in his, and spoke clearly, gently. "He knows it's okay." The room held its breath, not because of the words themselves, but because it was the First time Leia had spoken in front of anyone but her grandfather. Her voice wasn't loud, wasn't polished, but it was real. It was hers, and it carried the weight of survival wrapped in a single sentence. Coach Janelle looked at Raymond, whose hands trembled just slightly as he pulled his cap down, tighter over his brow. No one said anything. No one had to. Later that night, after the dishes were cleaned, and Shadow was curled up beside the fire, Raymond found Leia in her room, brushing her fingers along the spines of her books. She turned when he entered, but said nothing. "You did good today, sweetheart," he murmured. She gave a small shrug, then looked down at Shadow, who had patted him behind him. "He helped me." Raymond didn't answer right away. He didn't need to. He just knelt beside her and placed a hand on her shoulder, steady as ever. "Then I guess we keep showing up for whoever needs help next." That night, while the wind rattled loose, branches outside and the wood stove crackled in the quiet, Leia pulled a blanket over Shadow and leaned her head against him. The world hadn't healed, not completely, but something in it had begun to shift, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough to keep going. The moment hadn't been planned. No one had prepped her with a script. No camera crews had been expected. It was just another quiet Tuesday at the town library, a children's support group, session like any other. But when Shadow had patted across the room and gently laid his head in the lap of a boy named Caleb, who was struggling to read, through tears, and when Leia had instinctively reached out and whispered, "He knows it's okay," a miracle happened. Coach Janelle had filmed the moment with shaky hands and tear-filled eyes, intending only to share it with the boys' parents. But by that night, the clip had made its way to the local news station, and by the next morning, it had spread through every household in Silver Pine and far beyond, racking up tens of thousands of views from people who, like the children in that library room, had needed to believe that broken things could be made whole again. Reporters started calling before noon. The front porch creaked under the weight of curiosity and satellite equipment. Raymond stood on his lawn in his old army cap, arms folded, eyes narrowed at the circus that had parked itself outside his fence. He didn't care for spectacle. He didn't trust it. But he understood, perhaps better than most, what it meant when a message landed at the right time. Shadow didn't bark or growl at the visitors. He stayed close to Leia, always between her and the crowd. His posture relaxed, but watchful. Leia, to her grandfather's astonishment, didn't retreat. She didn't tremble. She simply held on to Shadow's fur and answered questions with her silence, until one reporter, younger than the rest and smart enough to kneel, instead of shove a microphone, gently asked, "What would you want people to know about him?" Leia looked down at Shadow, who blinked slowly at her as if waiting for her to lead. Her voice came out like mist curling off a lake at dawn, soft, unsure, but there. "He doesn't need to work again," she said. "He just needs to be loved." The clip aired that evening, and the phones didn't stop ringing for days. That weekend, a package arrived from an organization called Hearts and Paws. Inside was a handwritten note from its director, a woman named Elise Monroe, who had lost her husband in combat and started the nonprofit in his memory. The note praised Leia's quiet courage and Shadow's calm strength. They wanted to invite the pair to be the face of a new initiative focused on pairing children with trauma histories and retired working dogs. "We believe your story is the message we need," Elise wrote. "Would you consider being our first ambassadors?" Raymond read the letter 3 times then slid across the table to Leia. Her hands trembled when she picked it up. "Do I have to speak?" she asked. "Only if you want to," he replied. She nodded, then looked out the window to where Shadow lay stretched in the sun. The event was held at the county fairgrounds under the shade of white canvas tents with folding chairs, arranged in neat semicircles, and children playing with gentle dogs in every direction. Leia wore a simple blue dress and kept her eyes low until it was her turn. The MC called her name, and she stepped onto the platform with Shadow trotting at her side. The microphone was too tall. A volunteer lowered it. The crowd waited. A breeze rustled the tent flaps, and for a long moment, all anyone could hear was the sound of dogs panting and leaves whispering in the wind. Then Leia lifted her chin. Her voice cracked, but it didn't waver. "Shadow saved me," she said. "Not like in a movie. He didn't jump in front of a car or pull me out of fire. He just stayed. He listened when no one else knew what I needed. And I think maybe he needs someone to stay for him, too." A silence settled over the crowd, not the kind born of discomfort, but the kind that fell when people were truly listening. When she stepped down, Shadow walked close to her leg, tail wagging slowly, and she smiled at him with something that looked like peace. That night, as Raymond sat on the porch with his old radio humming low beside him, he opened a letter from a corporate sponsor. The stationery was thick, the offer generous. They wanted to partner with Leia and Shadow for a national campaign, pictures, commercials, merchandise. The final page was a contract outlining appearance fees, obligations, and a proposed schedule that spanned 3 months in 6 states. He stared at it for a long time. Then he folded the letter in half, slid it back in the envelope, and tossed it into the kitchen drawer where forgotten coupons and expired warranties went to die. Money was nice. Exposure had its place. But Leia had just started smiling again, just started sleeping without waking up, screaming. Shadow had just begun to stretch without wincing to follow her, without limping. He wouldn't risk either of them becoming a product. As dusk fell and the lights inside the house blinked on one by one, Raymond walked out to the porch where Elias sat curled beside Shadow on the wooden bench. Her fingers moved slowly through his fur, her legs tucked under her. Shadow lay still, one ear flicking occasionally, eyes half closed. She looked up when her grandfather approached. "He doesn't like crowds," she said softly. "Neither do I," he murmured. They didn't say anything else. They didn't have to. The porch creaked, the cycas sang, and for the first time in what felt like years, Raymond looked at his granddaughter and didn't see the wreckage of the accident. He saw strength and quiet joy and something else even rarer, the beginning of a future that might just hold more healing than hurt. By spring, the name Shadow had become familiar across 3 counties in northern Colorado, spoken in school hallways, whispered in libraries, scribbled in glitter markers on handmade bookmarks. He wasn't just a retired service dog anymore. He was the honorary therapy dog of Thompson counties, elementary schools, the silent companion of kids with nightmares, broken homes, and unspeakable fears. And beside him always was Leia Grant, no longer just the quiet girl in the corner, but a voice that other children now leaned toward to borrow strength. Each Monday and Thursday morning, Leia and a small group of teen volunteers from the local high school loaded canvas bins with picture books, early readers, and short novels into a district van. The books weren't chosen at random. They were stories about bravery and loneliness, animals who found homes, children who dared to be different, Shadow wore his blue hearts, and Paul's vest with quiet dignity, his gait still uneven but steady. When he stepped into the school building's kids lit up. Some ran to hug him. Others sat a few feet away, watching until they were ready. At first, Leia just listened. She sat beside Shadow and let others read to him. Let others discover that gentle eyes and soft breathing could melt the panic in their chests. Then one day when a little girl froze mid-sentence, unable to get the word thunder past her lips, Leia leaned in and whispered, "He's afraid of thunder, too." The girl blinked, nodded, and read the word. Over time, Leia's voice grew stronger. She stopped hesitating before raising her hand in class. She learned to laugh, even when the sound of it surprised her. Coach Janelle sometimes watched her from a distance at the sessions and wiped at her eyes quietly, astonished by the girls unfolding. Raymond noticed it too, not in grand gestures, but in small ones. How Leia no longer flinched when a fire truck passed, how she began answering the front door without needing to hide behind him, how she walked through the grocery store with her head high, not clinging to his sleeve. Then came the invitation, an email from the National Alliance of Child Therapy Programs. They were hosting their annual summit in Salt Lake City and wanted Leia to speak during the keynote session on community-based recovery models. Coach Janelle gently delivered the news, unsure how Leia would respond. The girl read the invitation slowly, then looked up, her fingers buried in Shadow's fur. "Do you think they'll let him come on stage with me?" The auditorium was enormous, rows upon rows of folding chairs, lights too bright for comfort, a microphone that hissed when tapped. Leia stood backstage clutching her note, cards, her mouth dry. She looked down at Shadow, who gave a soft chuff and rested his head against her leg. When her name was called, she stepped out into the light. Her knees shook a little, but Shadow patted calmly beside her. At the podium, she placed one hand on his head, the other gripping the wooden edge of the lectern. She didn't use her note. "Cards. I used to think silence meant safety," she began. "That if I didn't speak, nothing could break. Nothing could get worse. But then I met a dog who didn't bark either. He didn't beg. He didn't chase his tail to make people smile. He just sat there and breathed. And I realized I wasn't the only one. Holding my breath, the room fell completely still. Even the text near the back leaned in. I didn't just save a dog," Leia continued, her voice steady. "I met someone who saved me before I knew I needed it. He didn't ask me to talk. He waited. And every time I did say something, he stayed. When she finished, people stood. Some clapped. Some wiped tears. Shadow didn't seem fazed by the applause. He simply nudged Leia's leg, gently as if to say, "You did it." Months later, as summer approached and wildflowers bloomed across the valley, the students and staff of Fairview Elementary unveiled a new outdoor space. Behind their library, a semicircle of benches shaded by cottonwood trees, a smooth stone pathway, and a small wooden arch bearing a carved sign. Shadow's circle, where silence ends and courage begins. Leia stood at the center, Shadow at her feet, watching children file in, with books tucked under their arms. Some sat immediately and began to read aloud. Others needed time. Leia understood both. Raymond stood off to the side, hands in his pockets, his eyes wet. He had never seen her like this, open, calm, present, the kind of girl her parents always said she would become. He felt the ache of their absence, but also the fullness of their legacy alive in her. And as Leia smiled at a boy struggling with his first sentence, patting Shadow's back too, Let him know it was okay. Raymond realized something quietly, extraordinary. It had taken one small hand raised in the back of a dusty auction room to change everything. Not just for a dog who had been left behind, but for a child who now led others out of the quiet, and for a world that had finally learned a medicine